Good day, everyone. Welcome to Constitutional Law Lecture for Preliminary Period. So I am hoping I will be able to discuss in this lecture all the necessary topics included in our preliminary exam coverage as what I have stipulated in the course outline. Right? So please bear with me and just listen to this lecture because it will help you further understand the things that we have talked about, the things that we have discussed during our recitation. Okay, so let us discuss first what do you mean by political law. In the case of People versus Perfecto, the Supreme Court ruled or defined rather political law as the branch of public law that deals with the organization and operations of the governmental organs of the state and defines its relations with the inhabitants of the territory. In fact, political law involves a lot of subjects like the Constitutional Law 1, Constitutional Law 2, we have law on public officers, law on public corporations, municipal corporations, local government code, as well as the public international law, which I think you have taken in your previous years, right? So, um, in study of Juris Doctor, for example, you will encounter these subjects, I think, in the first 2 years in your study. So political law is just uh, a bar subject. It's a bar subject, but it composes a lot of subjects. So in other words, constitutional law is part of, political law since it is divided into two. Okay. So how did the Supreme Court rule in the case of Hinueno versus De Lima? Okay, um, you should read this case because this is a new case. It involves the um, controversy of the then Secretary of Justice Leila De Lima and the former President PGMA. Okay, so it has always been a culture in the Philippines that once a person or a president steps down from his office, you expect that there will be a lot of allegations and there will be a lot of charges held against you as soon as you step down. Okay. So what's important here is that how the Supreme Court defines constitution. Okay. According to the Supreme Court, constitution is the fundamental, paramount, and supreme law of the nation. It is deemed written in every statute and contract. If a law or an administrative rule violates any norm of the Constitution, that issuance is null and void and has no effect. Okay, as we have discussed all about the supremacy of the Constitution, in this case, the Supreme Court emphasized how supreme, how fundamental, and how powerful the Constitution is. Therefore, should a statute, for example, when I say statute, we may be referring to Republic Acts, proclamations, and executive orders, all as well as local ordinances, issuances of our public officials, it should be consistent and it should be in harmony with what the Constitution is saying. Otherwise, we can file a petition challenging the constitutionality to render that particular rule or that law as unconstitutional or invalid. So the Constitution is a testament to the living democracy in this jurisdiction. It contains the compendium of the guaranteed rights of individuals as well as the powers granted to and restrictions imposed on government officials and instrumentalities. It is that lone unifying code and inviolable authority that demands utmost respect and obedience. So always remember that Constitution is always written. But before, during the 1500s, during the 1600s, during the colonization, perhaps um, there was no written constitution at all. So since we were dominated by monarchical system of government, whatever comes out from the mouth of the monarch, okay, that becomes the rule, that becomes an expression of the constitution. Okay, but now constitution is written just like the constitution or the 1987 constitution of the Philippines. right? So as we observe and as we learn, the Constitution is composed of liberties. That's the Bill of Rights. Okay, these are guaranteed rights of individuals under Article 3 of the Constitution. It also composes the Constitution of Government. We have the three branches of government under Article 6, 7, and 8 respectively. Okay, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. Okay, also the constitution or a valid constitution should also provide for the means and ways of changing or amending or perhaps revising the constitution. In fact, we have two. Okay, it's either we conduct con or constitutional convention, or we conduct constitutional assembly. Okay, but it can also be uh, from the initiative of the Filipino people, because later on we will discuss the concept of republicanism. Okay, so the government of the Philippines is the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Okay, now, so as I always say in our discussions, okay, these are the scope of political law. Okay, political law itself, the constitutional law, administrative law, law on municipal corporations, law on public officers, election laws, and of course your public international law. Okay, so when we study constitution, we always have to make a caveat of the two kinds of the provisions in the constitution, because we can classify the provisions in the constitution into two. It's either that provision is a self-executing provision or it's a non-self-executing provision. So what do you mean by self-executing provision? This provision, which is complete by itself and becomes operative without the aid of supplementary or enabling legislation, or that which supplies sufficient rule by means of which the right it grants may be enjoyed or protected. Nature and extent of the right conferred and the liability imposed are fixed by the Constitution itself. So basically, an example of a self-executing provision is the one that is delineated under Article 3, Bill of Rights of the 1987 Constitution. In fact, when, for example, in search and seizure procedure, okay, so whenever there is a violation by a public official of your constitutional right under the Bill of Rights, you can always execute that. You can always use that to nullify the validity or to nullify the arrest or the procedure or manner of arresting by the public officer, okay, or in this case, police. Okay, when we say non-self-executing provisions, this refers primarily to the fundamental principles and state policies under Article 2 of the Constitution, okay, such as, for example, the Declaration of the Right of the People to, to information, the right of the people to a healthful and balanced ecology, for example, the right of Ah, no, not the right, but the prohibition on the political dynasty. Sir, why is there political dynasty in the Philippines when in fact the Constitution itself provides under Article 2 that it's actually prohibited? So the answer there is that not all provisions in the Constitution are self-executing. So when we say non-self-executing, you have to enact laws, you have to legislate through the legislative department or through the Congress that they should promulgate a law which will prohibit, okay, which will prohibit the dynasty laws, the dynasties of public officials here in the Philippines. Okay, so there are provisions which are self-executing, and there are provisions which are non-self-executing. Okay, for example, during a checkpoint there in Lasang, Davao City, Okay, so you're being searched, you know, you were asked to open your trunk, the trunk of your car, okay, without probable cause from the officer, no? So let's say, for example, he discovered something illegal, an illegal contraband inside your trunk. And if it proves, or you can actually defend, or you can actually use as a defense that the public officer has no probable cause. Therefore, he or she has no right to ask you to open your trunk at all, because under um, Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, okay, there are requirements that an officer should possess, for example, a search warrant before your premises, before your private properties are searched. Okay, so that is, of course, through the issuance of search warrant coming from the judge, okay, here in the Philippines. So without that search warrant, without warrant of arrest, any act of um, the public officer enforcing such law, enforcing such arrest or search would be rendered invalid or void. Okay, so that's an example of self-executing provision. Uh, the ones that are provided in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so when we say non-self-executing, katong mga principles, katong mga state policies, okay, the prohibition, for example, of um, nuclear weapons here in the Philippines, that's not automatic. Magawa ka muna ng batas para i-prohibit ang nuclear weapons here in the Philippines. Okay? Another example is under Section 9 and Section 10, which promotes social justice here in the Philippines. That's not automatic. The government has to legislate. The Congress has to legislate what are those services. SSS pension, the granting of 20% discount for senior citizens and differently abled persons. Okay, that's an example. All right, let's proceed. So as a general rule, all provisions of the Constitution are self-executory, meaning you can just execute them, meaning you can just invoke them. Okay, I invoke my right against self-incrimination under Section 17, if I'm not mistaken, of Article 3 of the Constitution. But just like the famous Janet Napoles during the Senate hearing. Okay, so if a certain question would likely incriminate you, okay, for that, or your answer can be used against you in a criminal court or in a criminal proceeding, then you have the right to refuse from answering the question on the ground of right against self-incrimination. As a general rule, all the provisions in the Constitution are executory, except first, when it is expressly provided that a legislative act is necessary to enforce a constitutional mandate. Second, provisions merely expressing general principles like declaration of principles and state policies, as what I told you under Article 2, also under Article 13, social justice and human rights, and as well as under Article 14, education, science, technology, arts, culture, and sports. That's the case of Manila Prince Hotel versus GSIS. So these particular articles, specific articles in the Constitution are not self-executive, but generally they are self-executory. Okay? So aside from Article 3, sir, about the Bill of Rights, what are other self-executing provisions? Example, the requirements for the presidency. Okay, these are all self-executing. You don't need to make a specific law, okay, delineating the requirements for candidates for president, candidates for vice president, candidates for, senators or congressmen, because these are all provided already in the Constitution, specifically provided in the Constitution. Okay, so what's the composition of the Philippine territory? national territory comprises the Philippine archipelago with all the islands and waters embraced therein, and all other territories over which the Philippines has sovereignty or jurisdiction, consisting of its terrestrial, fluvial, and aerial domains, including its territorial sea, the seabed, the subsoil, the insular shelves, and other submarine areas. The waters around, between, and connecting the islands of the archipelago, regardless of their breadth and dimensions, form part of uh, the internal waters of the Philippines. That's according to Article 1 of the 1987 Constitution. So this Article 1 defines entirely what the Philippine territory composes. Okay, so let's discuss about the concept of archipelagic doctrine. What do you mean by archipelagic doctrine? Archipelagic doctrine is found in the last sentence of Article 1. So the statement or the sentence, the waters around, between, and connecting the islands of the archipelago, regardless of their breadth and dimensions, form part of the internal waters of the Philippines. The main purpose, basically, of the archipelagic doctrine is to protect the territorial interests of an archipelago, its territorial integrity. Without it, there will be pockets of high seas between some of our islands and islets, thus foreign vessels would be able to pass through these pockets of seas and would have no jurisdiction over it. So, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea basically have established a rule in defining the territories of those archipelagic countries, for example, Philippines and Indonesia, because it's hard to define uh, the exact or definite territory of the Philippines. That's why the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea have set a specific nautical miles, specific distance coming from the baseline of a particular country or coming from the baseline of one archipelagic country to measure the rights, the ownership, and the economic privileges of a certain country with respect to their maritime territories. Okay. Now, this is a clear picture of the Philippine territory. Okay. So the light yellow line there is the baseline of the Philippine archipelago, and the archipelagic waters are within or the seas or the waters within the archipelago, while territorial sea is measured 12 nautical miles from the baseline. So there's the blue one, okay, that's the blue one, and then from the baseline, you measure 12 nautical miles, that's your territorial sea. In the territorial sea, we have ownership, we have territorial integrity over this territory, meaning meron tayong ownership dyan. Okay? It's different from exclusive economic zone because in exclusive economic zone, which is the subject of the dispute between China and Philippine government, in EEZ, okay, we do not have ownership over that maritime territory. Okay, contiguous zone is 24 nautical miles from the baseline, and the exclusive economic zone is 200 nautical miles from the baseline of the Philippine territory. Okay, for the EEZ, the Philippines has the right to use, to manage, and to exploit the resources found within the exclusive economic zone. So basically, a certain country, for example, like let's say a vessel from Papua New Guinea can actually pass the exclusive economic zone. But passage should mean and should be understood that you are not allowed to get and to acquire resources, okay? Whether it be oil, fish, okay, you are not allowed to fish there because that's within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippine government. The Philippines has economic rights that are protected within this territory. Okay? So, actually, the exclusive economic zone has been the subject also of controversy since we had a recent arbitration ruling between the Philippines and the Chinese government. Okay, and that actually includes the EEZ of the Philippines. But if you base it in UNCLOS really, and if you have read the decision of the arbitration court, okay, um, on the basis of the laws provided by the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, those islands, the Kalayaan Group of Islands and the Spratly Islands and the Scarborough Shoal are actually part and parcel of the EEZ of the Philippines. And if you try to look at the map of China, it's far away uh, distant from the Philippine territory or the Philippine EEZ. Okay, but China is claiming still based on the 9-dash line map, which almost covers all the maritime territories of Southeast Asia. Okay, and that's very difficult because the problem in the international politics is the enforcement of your ruling, the enforcement of the decision of the arbitration court. Because, as you know, China is not recognizing the decision. China is telling that, oh, we do not recognize the decision because we are not party to that decision in the first place, and that's an invalid and illegal decision. So that's also the difficult part of international politics because enforcement is not the same concept with how do we define enforcement within the national territory. Okay? Enforcement in a particular sovereign nation is easy. Okay, if you do not follow the ruling, you can be imprisoned, you can pay fines, you can pay penalty, etc., etc. But in international politics, it's very, very difficult and it's very, very complicated. Okay. Now, let's proceed with the Declaration of Principles and State Policies. By the way, um, I will send you a link as a supplemental guide and supplementary discussion on Article 1, the National Territory of the Philippines. So I'll just send you a link. It's actually a video, okay, from YouTube, okay, explaining also the national territory of the Philippines. Okay, under the doctrine of constitutional supremacy, if a law or contract violates any norm of the Constitution, that law or contract, whether promulgated by the legislative or by the executive branch or entered into by private persons for private purposes, is null and void and without any force and effect. Since the Constitution is the fundamental, paramount, and supreme law of the nation, it is deemed written in every statute and contract. For example, um, the law amending the amending, for example, a law promulgated by the legislative department, which punishes um, violators or which punishes individuals who violate such law. Okay, so it imposes death as a penalty for those violating the said law. So, can you question the validity and the constitutionality of that law? The answer is yes, because under the Constitution, it suspends, okay, death as a penalty for any offense or for any crime committed within the Philippine territory. Because the justification there is that we are signatory to the UN Charter and we are signatory to the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which um, asks every sovereign nation to suspend or perhaps prohibit death penalty in case of any violation in our national laws. So in that case, we can actually challenge the validity and the constitutionality of that particular law. Okay? Because again, it is not in harmony with what the Constitution is saying. It is not consistent with what the Constitution is saying, right? Sir, what if we will make a law, or Congressman A, for example, makes a law, no, allowing political dynasties here in the Philippines? Can you question the constitutionality? Yes. Okay, because under um, Section 27, I'm not sure, if I'm not mistaken, under Section 27, it prohibits political dynasties here in the Philippines. So if you make a law allowing political dynasty here in the Philippines, that would not be consistent, and that would be uh, a concrete contravention, okay? A contravention to what the Constitution is saying. Because under the doctrine of constitutional supremacy, the laws, okay, or contracts should be in harmony and should not violate any norm of the Constitution, any provision of the Constitution. That's why the provisions of the Constitution are very powerful, because it would examine, it would be the guiding principle in making our laws, in providing or in promulgating our laws here in the Philippines. Okay, so how do you answer that if that's given in the exam? Under the doctrine of constitutional supremacy, it should not violate any norm of the Constitution. It should not violate any provision. Okay, no matter how small, no matter how minute the provision is. Okay, if that is what the Constitution is saying, then we should follow what the Constitution says. What's the spirit of the Constitution? Okay, Philippines is a republican state. Okay, as um, pronounced, or as specifically and concretely um, pronounced in the Constitution. Okay, so what is republican state? A state wherein all government authority emanates from the people and is exercised by representatives chosen by the people. That's the case of Tolentino versus Comelec, no, in the dissenting opinion of Justice Puno. Okay, so when we say republicanism, the public officers, the public officials are chosen by the people. Okay, we do not just appoint who should be president, who should be vice president, who should be senators, who should be congressmen. Okay, so we conduct elections to choose our public officials. That's why when we vote for a correct politician, we will be suffering for the next 6 years, for the next 3 years, since the people are the ones who decided, and the people are the ones who voted for that official. But the point there is that in a Republican system, in a Republican government, the officers and the the power of the state emanates from the people. Hence, Philippines is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Okay. So what are manifestations of republicanism? Okay. First, ours is a government of laws and not of men. Second, rule of majority, plurality in elections. Diba? We follow plurality in elections. We do not follow majority. Okay? So, kung sino yung may pinakamataas na boto sa eleksyon, sa panalo. Okay? Despite the fact that he or she did not attain the simple majority, no, as we always follow in simple gatherings, in simple meetings. Okay? But as far as electing our public officials, we follow the plurality method. Kung sino yung may pinakataas na boto, siya ang ating i-elect now for that position. Okay? Third, accountability of public officials. Okay? Should there be, when we say accountability, okay, you have to be accountable from the mistakes and violations of your people. Okay? If you're the president of the Philippines, you cannot say that, oh, there's actually a secretary for that. Okay? There's actually a head of that bureau. So blame that head of the bureau and not me. Okay? Accountability means you have supervision over these officials, especially with your alter egos. In the case of the president, okay, you appoint your what? You appoint your alter egos, your secretaries of the different agencies in the government, Secretary of Health, Secretary of Education, Secretary of DOST, Secretary of DPWH, etc., etc. So the mistake, the misfeasance, malfeasance, or any administrative case they are facing, you are accountable because you are the one who elect, who appointed them, and you should have supervision over what they do. That's why they have to report to you. Okay, and that's accountability. And you cannot just say that, okay, blame that person and not me. No, that's not accountability. Accountability means that since you have first you have supervision, you have access to what he or she is doing, and since he or she is your alter ego, okay, then you are accountable to the Filipino people. What else? The Bill of Rights. Basically, Philippine Constitution has Bill of Rights under Article 3. Okay, that's also a manifestation of what a Republican state is. Fifth, legislature cannot pass irrepealable laws. Okay, and six, separation of powers. Okay, so we all know that under Article 6, 7, and 8 of the Constitution, under Article 6, it defines the function of the legislative government or department. Under Article 7, the executive. Under Article 8, the judiciary. And they have different and distinct orders under the Constitution. They have different functions. They have different duties. And they should focus on that duty. And they should not interfere, okay, nor influence, okay, nor intervene with the works of other departments. And that's separation of powers. Okay? If your duty is to legislate, just legislate. You do not have the right to declare war. You do not have the right to provide decisions, interpret the laws. Okay? Apply the laws because that's the duty of the judiciary. Okay? The president therefore cannot decide on behalf of the Supreme Court because that's under the judiciary. Otherwise, he will be violating the doctrine of separation of powers. Take note that the Philippines is not only a representative or republican state, but also shares some aspects of direct democracy that affords to the citizens a greater participation in the affairs of the government, such peoples as initiative and referendum, the right to information on matters of public concern. For instance, you think that there should be a law to be passed, and you observe that ever since, okay, the administration or this congressman has been in that office, they have not taken any action. For example, okay, let's uh, take the anti-political dynasty law, as an example. It has always been pending, okay, in the Congress. Okay? So can we make an initiative? Yes, you can file a petition, no, for initiative or as the initiative of people. So initiative can be three, no? Initiative to create a statute, initiative to create a local ordinance, no? Or a local law, and the initiative to perhaps changing the constitution or amending the constitution, right? And referendum follows after an initiative. So if you file an initiative before the COMELEC, of course, there's a required voting for that. And if the COMELEC thinks that the initiative or the petition is sufficient, so the COMELEC will conduct the referendum. Okay? How about the state policy on war? No, the state renounces war as an instrument of national policy. Okay. So, sir, do we have any other laws aside from the Constitution bolstering or somehow strengthening the basis of our laws here in the Philippines? Yes, the United Nations Charter itself, okay, made a policy in the renunciation of war as an instrument of national policy. In other words, we prohibit or we renounce aggressive war, but we allow defensive war. Of course, kung giraho na ka sa China o giraho na ka sa Japan or Indonesia, alangan dili usupol si Philippine government. In that case, if there's already invasion, in case when there's already rebellion, okay, that's the time that you can already defend your territory. You have the right to defend the people, defend the Philippine government and the Philippine territory. Okay? But you do not have the right to invade other countries. You do not have the right to what? You do not have the right to announce or declare war, okay, without any reasons at all. But when you are in a defensive, for example, situation that you are being attacked, then that's the time that policy on war is allowed. Okay. So take note, the Philippines does not renounce defensive war because it is duty bound to defend its citizens under the Constitution. The prime duty of the government is to serve and protect the people. Okay. It's also provided under Section 4, Article 2 of the Constitution. Again, the primary duty of the government is to serve and protect. In fact, in cases when there's war, for example, the government has the right and the authority and the power to compel citizens to fight for the country and to defend the Philippine territory. And this it does not necessarily violate the Constitution as justified in Jacobs versus Massachusetts. Okay, an American jurisprudence. Okay, so in that case, kung wala na talaga, naubos na ang military natin, okay, the civilian will be compelled by the state to fight for the territory of the Philippine government. Okay. So how about the independent foreign policy and a nuclear-free Philippines? Under Section 7, Article 2 of the 1987 Constitution, it states that the state shall pursue an independent foreign policy. In its relations with other states, the paramount considerations shall be national sovereignty, territorial integrity, national interest, and the right to self-determination. So in all its actions, since the grand architect of our foreign policy is the President. Okay? So si Presidente ragyod ang naay right na mag-agree and engage into talks, into executive agreements with other foreign sovereign nations, and no other person can do that because he's the grand architect of our foreign policy. Okay, so what should the president consider in entering into relationship with other countries, in neighboring countries? Okay, he should consider the national sovereignty. Would this decision diminish the national sovereignty of my country? Would it affect the territorial integrity of my country? For example, okay, what is the interest of my people? What's the interest of the Filipino people in entering this executive agreement with US, with China, with Russia, for example, and the right to self-determination? So these are all the limitations of the power and authority of the state and the president, okay, to pursue an independent foreign policy. So it violates the national sovereignty, it violates the territorial integrity, the national interest, and the right to self-determination. Then it's the duty of the president to protect all this. And when the president allows, okay, when the president allows that these principles are contravened, that these principles are being violated, that are taken away from us, then that's the time that we can already question the act of the state and the act of the government in its relationship with other country. Okay? What if the Philippine president surrenders a parcel of our territory to other country? Then that's the time when we can challenge the action of the Philippine president in entering into agreements with other states. Okay? The Philippines, consistent with the national interest, adopts and pursues a policy of freedom from nuclear weapons in its territory. Okay, so it is explicitly provided in the Constitution that we, as much as possible, that we are free from nuclear weapons. Okay, just read the provision under Article 2 if you have your copy of the Constitution. I think it's found in lawfil.net. Okay, there's a copy of the entire text of the 1987 Constitution. Okay, so how did the Constitution of the Philippines defines or appreciate, so to speak, social justice? Okay. The Constitution actually is for equality, okay, because of the acute gap between the rich and poor in the Philippines. It is intended to somehow equate, okay, the status of the Filipino people living in the Philippines. Okay, so it actually specifically and explicitly mandates the government to provide and promote social justice. So what are these social justice? These are all social services, kabahay, okay, social assistance, social benefits for example, differently abled person, for the benefit of the senior citizen, for example, for hospitalization bills, for example, for providing medicines. These are all social programs of the government. Okay. So, sir, how do we define social justice? Okay. In the case of Kalalang versus Williams, no, in the case 1940 case, social justice has been defined as neither communism nor despotism, nor atomism nor anarchy, but the humanization of laws and the equalization of social and economic forces by the state so that justice in its rational and objectively secular conception may at least be approximated. Social justice means the promotion of the welfare of all the people, the adoption by the government of measures calculated to ensure economic stability of all the competent elements of society through the maintenance of a proper economic and social equilibrium in the interrelations of the members of the community, constitutionally through the adoption of measures legally justifiable, or extra-constitutionally through the exercise of powers underlying the existence of all governments on the time-honored principle of salus populi est suprema lex. Salus populi est suprema lex literally means the safety or the welfare of the people is the supreme law. So social justice primarily is established or is being introduced or promoted to help the people, to promote the welfare of the people. For example, by giving ayuda, in times of ECQ or enhanced community quarantine, okay, by providing programs on 4Ps, okay, but we have that 4Ps for those qualified Filipinos who can accept them, okay. So these are all forms of social justice. Okay, stated, it's the humanization of laws and the equalization of social and economic forces. Okay, we provide jobs, the government will provide you. Okay, so that's why we have to fight for what is due and what is right for the Filipino people. Because after all, this is the duty of the government to provide all this. Okay, as categorically um, mandated by the 1987 Constitution. So they have the power and it is their duty to promote social justice. Okay? That's why government officials should not be entitled for providing services for the people because after all, and in the first place, okay, it is their duty and it is their responsibility to provide all this. Okay? And we should not um, make them perhaps sacred for what they have done because this is the thing which they are supposed to do. This is their duty when they accepted and when they are elected as public officers in our government. Okay, so what are the policies of the state on the following? Working women, the 1987 Constitution, under Section 14, the state shall protect working women by providing safe and helpful working conditions, taking into account their maternal functions and such facilities and opportunities that will enhance their welfare and enable them to realize their full potential in the service of the nation. Okay. Before, during the 1500s, when we were under the Spanish colonization, okay, women has no rights. Women had suffered from abuses from the Spaniard, from the during the American occupation. They have been victims of oppression, okay, victims of abuses, and they were not given rights at that time. But now women are being empowered. In fact, we have VAUSI, okay, the Republic Act 9262. Okay. So for as long as you can establish that you have a dating relationship, then you can sue that man, you know, for for violating your rights as a woman. Okay. So um here in this provision, the Constitution provides working women a helpful working conditions. In fact, in one case decided by the Supreme Court, I think it's in the case of Philippine Airlines versus I forgot the other party, but that's the case, the Philippine Airlines case, when when the workers of the airline sued, okay, the Philippine Airlines because they have dismissed those pregnant women or pregnant FAs, flight stewardess, you know, because you cannot work anymore if you are pregnant, okay? So they dismissed those FAs who were pregnant. According to the Supreme Court, you cannot do this, okay? Because that is one of the maternal functions of a woman in the society. Okay? So, was the dismissal valid at that time? The answer is no. Okay? The Philippine Airlines illegally dismissed these employees. Okay? So, the Supreme Court really upheld the Constitution and really protective of the women. And they should not be uh, prejudiced because of the fact that they are pregnant. Okay? So that's an example. No? What else? Ecology. The 1987 Constitution, the state shall protect and advance the right of the people and their posterity to a balanced and helpful ecology. Okay, so what's an example for this? The principle of intergenerational responsibility. Okay. The concept of international or the intergenerational responsibility was upheld, of course,